Okay, good afternoon, and the reason for this video is, as a university teacher, I'm taken by the fact that a lot of theoretical perspectives, a lot of theoretical understandings of the world very much remain outside of the world. They end up in books that a lot of people, the general population, don't read, and they're not actually used as tools to actually understand social phenomena, to understand the world around us. So in this brief video, I want to take a theoretical perspective, a theory, and use that theory to unpack and to illuminate and to help us to understand a particular social phenomena. The social phenomena I'm going to be looking at are two particular YouTubers called Brad and Lex, who are millennials who are looking at music and interpreting and reacting to music that occurred before they were born. So the 60s, the 70s, the 80s and the 90s. And they're interpreting this music having not heard it. Well, that's the whole perception that comes across anyway. I don't know if they have heard some of this music, but a lot of it certainly doesn't seem to come from their cultural background. In this particular clip, they're looking at the Smiths song, "There Is a Light That Never Goes Out." So why would looking at this particular social phenomena or cultural phenomena be interesting through a theoretical perspective? So let's begin first with the theory, and then we'll take the theory or the prism or the lens and look at this social phenomena, these YouTubers, through this theoretical lens. So you kind of are understanding or getting to understand some very deep and complex theory in a way that I hope is enjoyable and very easy to understand, hopefully. So this is the book that's put a lot of people off. It's called The Master and His Emissary. And it's a huge book, as you can see. And I've given it to people and they've said it's just too dense, too long. I think it's beautifully written. I'd highly recommend it if you have a chance to buy it. But the main idea I'm going to look at today is the basic thesis that Iain McGilchrist puts across in his book. So in the book, he says, my thesis is that for us as human beings, there are two fundamentally opposed realities, two different modes of experience, that each is of ultimate importance in bringing about the recognizably human world. So this is the way that we understand the human world, through these two opposed realities. What's he talking about? So he's saying, and their difference is rooted in the bi-hemispheric structure of the brain. So this is quite an amazing statement. So he's saying that the brain, the fact that our brains are split into left and right hemispheres, actually inherently and biologically determines the way that we view the world. Very different from someone like Marx, who says that we're very much influenced by our environment. Our environment, it's environmental factors that influence the consciousness or the way that we consciously perceive the world. This is almost, well, it's saying something else. It's saying that biologically, the fact that we have this brain that's split into left hemisphere and right hemisphere, this is actually the overriding paradigm that dominates the way we experience the world. So this is a very basic split of the brain as perceived, left hemisphere in the blue and the right hemisphere in the pink. And again, in McGilchrist, he's very sort of wary of these simplistic diagrams, but this particular one I think is quite true and doesn't say more than it needs to. So your left hemisphere of your brain deals mainly in logic, science, sense of time, language. It is explicit. It focuses in on intimate things in a way that the right hemisphere does not. So the right hemisphere, as represented on the right, is creative, artistic, intuitive, and is dealing with things that come out of our imagination. And it is also very much holistic, very much looking at the world as a whole. So what's a good analogy? What's a good way to think of this? Well, think of a bird searching for a worm in a back garden. Now the bird is using its left hemisphere of the brain when it's looking directly for the worm. So it's looking directly at the earth or the ground, and that is using the left hemisphere, but it also has to use its right hemisphere. Why? Because it needs to be aware at the same time of predators. So the part of the brain that's focusing on the worm is completely caught up in that activity, but the right hemisphere at the same time works with the left hemisphere to make the bird aware if there are any predators approaching in that same time. Now, that happens for human beings too, and you'll notice it in your everyday life. You can be driving a car and be focusing on the road and yet you're having these incredible thought processes going on in your head, or you're listening to music and you're just being carried away. Sometimes I've driven from one place to another and I've just arrived and I've not remembered very much of the drive. That's not because I'm drunk. It's just because I'm not there, literally. My left brain is doing the job that it needs to keep the car going along the road and stopping at traffic lights. But I'm very much immersed in my right hemisphere. I'm listening to a piece of music. And this is the way that human beings operate. And this is a wonderfully, incredibly, incredible understanding way that we view the world. And if we go back to the ancient Greeks, they also had a way of splitting the world into two parts, Logos and Mythos. And I must admit, when I first read about this many years ago, I thought that's very convenient, the way that the Greeks and really everyone tries to split things into two, and surely that doesn't have any kind of ultimate reality. It's just an easy way to organize things, that we have dualistic binaries that we use all the time, dark and light, and so on and so forth. But no, the Greeks, if we follow McGilchrist, it's that we're actually hardwired to think in these two separate ways. If we look at the way the Greeks split reality up, it's very similar to this modern understanding through the hemispheres of the brain understanding of the world. So it's saying that the Greeks intuitively kind of came across this. Obviously, they weren't able to look inside our brains in the way that we can in the modern world, but they still came across or put across this idea that's very similar. So Logos, it's due to sense perception, science and maths, literalism, objectivity, and Mythos is much more religion and art, subjectivity and meaning, and language and emotion. Very similar if we go back to the split between the left and right hemisphere. Focused the left on analysis, logical thinking, and so on and so forth. The right focused on synthesis that I talked about, the bird, that seeing the holistic presentation of the world, and creates emotion, produces dreams, the artistic, intuitive part of our way of perceiving reality. And Iain McGilchrist writes, "It follows that the hemispheres need to cooperate, but I believe that they are in fact involved in a sort of power struggle, and that this explains many aspects of Western culture." Well, what's he saying here? If we look at the title again, it's called The Master and His Emissary. So McGilchrist is saying that the right hemisphere, because of its ability to take in the whole of the world, or the whole of reality at the same time, is what should be the master, not the left hemisphere that can only take in singular parts of reality. And although the left hemisphere has been incredibly important in 500 years of Western culture, in the way that post-Enlightenment we've become the most scientific, rational in many ways, and we've been able to send people to the moon and so on and so forth, we or the West has, but there's been a sacrifice. And Nietzsche, the famous German philosopher, said that Socrates is responsible ultimately for this terrible pathway that the West has been down ever since the 5th century BCE. So his savage critique on Socrates was that he held up rationality and what we would call left hemisphere thinking, or logocentric thinking, as being the highest ideal. So famously, Socrates interviewed playwrights of his time and asked them how did they write their plays. And he was horrified to hear that the playwrights said that they used their instincts to write the plays, that it seemed to come from the gods. And Socrates says that is a terrible way to actually create things, that we should be rational and conscious. And Nietzsche says that kind of thinking has dominated Western culture ever since. And certainly in the post-Enlightenment period till now, there's been a very much a focus on science, logic, rationality and singular focusing, and not this holistic way of viewing the world that would be connected to the right hemisphere. So McGilchrist does see this in a negative sense. And if we go on, another quote from the book, he says, We live in an era where articulating and making explicit are of increasing importance and are treated as a mark of truth, and their inverse is treated with increasing suspicion. So what would be the inverse? Well, we think of science as being held up as the highest value and ideal rational thinking in our current culture in the West, and religion, spirituality, anything to do with states of being that cannot be rationally and scientific understood is seemingly very much at the moment being dismissed and devalued. So he writes, the left hemisphere relies on the literal aspects of language to make meaning explicit. By contrast, metaphor and narrative are often required to convey implicit meanings available to the right hemisphere. So language is very tricky. And if you've read any English literature or literature of any sort, you will see that metaphor and even parables, a way that we understand certain truths that cannot be understood in a scientific sense. And Iain McGilchrist is saying, in his theoretical perspective, that this is something that is problematic in the West. We've become too focused on the left hemisphere, too logocentric, too rational and scientific, and too dismissive of the other half of what it is to be a human being. And this is very much, we can look at this in history. We can go back to the idea of what a parable is. And a parable literally that dominates the New Testament, the kind of foundational text of Western culture, is a comparison between two things, if we look in Greek terms. Frequently an earthly story that demonstrates a spiritual reality. So there's a quote from the New Testament. Jesus says, therefore I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And this is very much, we can hear in this quote that Jesus perceives that the people, even of his time in Palestine, at the beginning of AD, 30 AD or whenever it was, if we're looking at that particular calendar, actually were trying to understand his teachings rationally and logically, explicitly, but that his teachings could only get to them through parables. So through parables, by using analogies, the parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the prodigal son, by actually telling a story so that people aren't directly exposed to a teaching story, but they come across it themselves, and therefore that helps them to actually use their own minds and actually work themselves into the story, which is a crucial part of understanding myth and any religious story, really, or even any literature. So this way of perceiving the world is very much dismissed in our current climate. And Iain McGilchrist talks about this. So lastly, he says, in a left hemisphere dominated culture, metaphors and narratives are disregarded as myths and fables, or at worst, downright lies. So you probably come across people saying, "Oh, it's just a myth. It's not really true." We live in an era where articulating and making explicit are of increasing importance and are treated as a mark of truth, and their inverse is treated with increasing suspicion. So yes, spirituality is very much increasingly viewed with suspicion in our current time. So McGilchrist's theory is that we've become too dominated by the left hemisphere, and we need to move back to the more holistic right hemisphere. So we'll watch a brief clip where he talks about the importance of the right hemisphere being the master rather than the emissary.
What I want to stress at this juncture is the importance of union and division together. So we need to be able to divide and analyze. We need to be able to synthesize, i.e. to bring things together and see the whole, but we need to do both of those together.
Yeah.
We don't want either one or the other. We want both
so it's not
and.
one's better than the other.
Well, no, it is. I would say, for a whole host of reasons, that actually the right hemisphere is the one that sees more and is more important, as the master is more important than the emissary, as the person who puts data into a computer. The computer does things that the person isn't going to do, and takes the data out and uses it. The computer isn't an equal partner in that, if you see what I mean. So the left hand is very good at carrying out procedures, and as such is hugely valuable, as a good computer is, but it mustn't become the master. And there are so many sayings from modern physicists, including David Bohm, and is also attributed to Einstein, but also from the ancient Chinese wisdom literature. The idea of a usurper who is the conscious mind, who takes over from the wiser master. Yes. In fact, they use the terminology of master and servant. I didn't know this actually at the time when I wrote the book. A lot of it I've come across in the last 10 years.
Yeah, and the Sorcerer's Apprentice as well.
The Sorcerer's Apprentice, exactly the story. And you know, of course, that was Goethe.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Be dominated by the left hemisphere, McGilchrist argues, is a very impoverishing view of the world, and it causes pathological behaviour, because as human beings we need to use both our left and right hemisphere and not just be focusing on the singular but be focusing on the entirety of things. And even the concerns about the environment, or the neglect of the environment, the neglect of the way anything that stands out, the idea of the mind and the body being separate, that we can dominate and cultivate the earth without actually thinking about the general way that this will actually impinge and come back on us on our own living, is something that would be very left hemisphere view of the world. So let's now go and look at the actual way that we're going to look into the YouTube. Okay, so now what I want to do is actually look at this clip, look at this social phenomena of Brad and Lex through this theoretical perspective put across by Iain McGilchrist in The Master and the Emissary. So how are we going to do this? Well, firstly, let's a bit of background. Brad and Lex are two YouTubers who literally listen to music that was made before their time. So they're listening to music of the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. They're millennials. And it's also a lot of the time it would be out of their cultural purview. It'd be some music that they wouldn't have grown up with. So in this case, it's the Smiths. There Is a Light That Never Goes Out, which wouldn't have been something that they grew up with. And they're kind of interpreting it in this kind of naive sense that they haven't come across it before. But what I was really taken by was that they both encapsulate both these sides of the different sides of the brain. In that Brad represents and encapsulates the left hemisphere, and Lex, she encapsulates the right hemisphere. So if we go back and look at the different hemispheres, Brad, and I had nothing to do with the blue and the pink, but it does sort of serve our purpose in this case. Brad is his left hemispheric view of this particular song by the Smiths is trying to be logical, rational, and to focus on language, and explicit meaning is really important to Brad. And Lex is much more intuitive, listening to the music, letting it sweep over her, not focusing directly on the lyrics, but taking in the whole song as a whole. I have made this connection, so it's not something that is obvious, or that they're kind of have buried in this interpretation. It's something that struck me when I watched it. So when you watch this particular clip, I want you to think of what I've talked about, that you think of the worm analogy, the bird focusing on the worm. That Brad is the bird using the left hemisphere, trying to focus on the lyrics and make sense of them in a logical, rational sense. Now, this Smiths song is anything but logical and rational in a lot of ways. So this song by the Smiths, an English band, entitled There Is a Light That Never Goes Out, portrays a man travelling in a car by his lover's side, they're out driving, who would prefer to die by being hit by a double-decker bus or a 10-ton truck than have this love despoiled by worldly existence. And another thing to think about in connection to this song is the fact that in this way, the sentiment and subject matter of this song is both nihilistic and romantic at the same time, not to mention irrational and illogical, and therefore eschews a left hemisphere understanding. So ultimately, Lex's view of this song using her right hemisphere is the best interpretation, and we'll see the way it plays out. And it can also, I would argue, show or illustrate the way that in the West we need to be more like Lex in this current period of time and less like Brad. Not that either of these perspectives are wrong, the Brad's perspective is just as legitimate as Lex, and that also that Iain McGilchrist points out that we're not just either left or right hemisphere dominated, that each and every one of us in our day-to-day activities and perceptions of the world use both our left and right hemisphere. But in this particular clip, I think we can really detect the difference between these two hemispheres. And on the one thing to look at is the way that, yeah, as I mentioned, Brad's focusing on the lyrics, trying to logically focus in on one thing like a worm, and Lex is just letting the music sweep over her. So let's watch it and try and make sense of how they perceive and interpret this Smith song through these different perspectives.
Take me out tonight. Oh, take me anywhere. Don't care, don't care, don't care. Driving in your car. I never want to go home because I haven't got one more alone. Oh, I haven't got one. Another double-decker bus crashes into us. To die by your side is such a heavenly way to die. And then the 10-ton truck kills the both of us. To die by your side when the pleasure and the privilege is mine.
That felt kind of dark to me.
Yeah, I don't get it.
Or but like emo dark. Like instead of a bus hits us, it's like it's a double-decker bus. And instead of like just a box truck, it's like a 10-ton truck.
What is the light that never goes out?
It's like the spark of their relationship.
But he wants them both to die.
Yeah, but he's saying no matter if they die, the light will never go out.
How?
Because, like, you know, I guess the orb, when people die, the orb leaves in the orb of light. You know what I mean? And something like that. I feel like he's saying that they're going to be together forever. Like, the love is real. It's not so simple as death can separate us. You know what I mean? Some real Romeo and Juliet lyrics.
Okay, so yeah, that really encapsulates it there. I'll just play one more bit, but yes, you can see the left and right hemispheres operating or represented as Brad and Lex, as Lex is being the one using metaphor, and Brad is very much chafing against this explanation, saying, how can the light not go out? They're dead. And then she uses a metaphor of the orb that carries on. Their relationship becomes a spiritual entity that lives after them. That's very much what Morris is talking about in that song. There is a light that never goes out. But in our current climate, these things are all looked upon with great suspicion from the logos-centric, left hemispheric view of life that does not allow metaphor or spiritual realities to exist and can only see things from a rational and also focused perspective. There's one other bit of this clip that I'll play just where she just talks about the fact that the romance in this song, and he again finds this hard to understand because he's looking at it from a very rational, logical perspective. If the main protagonist is going to die, nothing good will come from it, rather than from an artistic, spiritual viewpoint where that idea of the ultimate consummation in death with another person is carries on right back into our history, not just Romeo and Juliet, but Wagner's operas Tristan and Isolde, and going way back to this idea that death is the ultimate consummation, meaning that life is not just a materialistic, rational, logocentric left hemisphere view that is encapsulated with Brad.
Okay, this reminds me of that song that we just listened to, where the dude was talking about drowning an unsung man, and except this one, he's like, we can die together. Hello, this true love.
Why does everybody want to die?
Because that's the most extreme sacrifice ever. It is. It's like the real, you know, giving yourself up for the other.
Okay, so yeah, there we have it. They're a couple, but they're representing left and right hemisphere, and you can see the confusion in Brad and the acceptance in Lex. And it's certainly not saying that one view is better than the other, or that Brad doesn't have a right hemisphere perspective, because he certainly does. But we can see in this particular case, this particular interpretation of this song, that the title itself is a metaphor, and explicitly and implicitly talks about something that cannot be captured in logical and rational sensibility. So this song cannot be understood unless you're using your right hemisphere. Well, thank you for listening to me today, and I hope I actually made some of you maybe want to go and explore and look up this book by Iain McGilchrist, and you'll certainly you can check out the clip by Lex and Brad on YouTube, and they do also interpret many other songs in the same way. Not consciously, they're not consciously trying to represent left and right hemisphere, but they do, and it's fascinating to watch it. So yes, a good understanding hopefully of using a theory to actually make sense of some social phenomena, and not just operating in a theoretical metaphysical ivory tower. So thank you, and I'll sign off for now.